recording. We are super excited to have Dr. William Green here presenting today. He is somebody that I have seen on a variety of sources on the internet and on TV even, and radio. So a little bit of everything. So he has gotten all over the place to share stories because he is an incredible author, historian, and educator. And as a professor, a retired professor, he has been teaching people like us forever, right? And we are just excited to have him sharing his knowledge. This was inspired by us reading The Vanishing Half, which is a book that was the community read for the last 2 months. And we were just looking at books that we might be able to deep dive a little bit further and look at what Minnesota is like. What are some of our conversations that we might want to be thinking about when we think about Minnesota? And I talked to Dr. William Green of fair share about what topic, and he has so many books he's written and so many topics he could discuss that it was hard to narrow it down, wouldn't you say? We are really excited that this is the one he picked because this one is such a pivotal, I think, book for us to be thinking about, especially as it talks about the anti-lynching laws and its connection to Duluth and our region. And as we look at African American History Month, but also Women's History Month, this is sort of such a perfectly timed book to be discussing, but one that we could be discussing any month or be thinking about the topics within it. And I'm excited to hear about this person that sort of disappeared a little bit from history, and yet you've unearthed her story and able to bring it to the forefront. And I was excited as I was Googling her, seeing that maybe I had read a little bit about her already when they did Minnesota Historical Society did the Voting for Women Act information a couple of years ago. And that was just super fun to see that I had heard a little bit, but definitely didn't know as much as this book includes or what we're about to learn. So I want to turn it over to you. I want to welcome everybody here today. If you do have questions today, I welcome you to put them in the chat. Because this is being recorded, you are open to raising your hand, letting me know, and we will let you unmute, but just know that you'll be part of the recording. If you put it into the chat, I can read it off and you can be anonymous if you wish. So that's up to you. I'm just excited to learn from you. Everything I know so far, Dr. Green makes me want to give you every moment of this time to talk. So I'm going to toss it over. If you have questions or need anything from me, just let me know.
Thank you very much. I do have one question for you. I see on the slide or the statement on top of it, this meeting is being recorded, and there's a blue button that says "Got it." Can I hit that button?
Oh yeah, push got it.
Without seeing anything blow up? Okay.
No, you're great.
All right. I'm sharing with the whole group the fact that as a retired history prof, I know nothing about buttons. You'd think I learned by now. For the past 3 years, actually, since COVID, Augsburg and classes have been online. And, it was beginning to work out interestingly, but since retiring, I forgot everything that I learned. So I'm just going to be real careful with the buttons that I push, and I hope that you can indulge me in this. Today, as Kelsey said, this is a discussion about our presentation on Nellie Francis, who I think is arguably the most interesting person in Minnesota history. Maybe 10 years ago or less, probably less, if you were to drive down Interstate 94 in St. Paul and glance at the state capitol, you may recall seeing the capitol wrapped up as it was being refurbished from within, and it looked like it was being gift wrapped. Part of that effort was to reconsider not only how to polish off the beauty of that structure, and as many of you know, it's just an incredibly beautiful building. You also probably know that most of the images on the walls in the Capitol are of men, and mainly from the 19th century. And so one of the discussions that the governor wanted us to consider was, how do we place art? How do we select art that reflects the Minnesota that we know? Showing respect for the Minnesota that was in the past. How do we make the Capitol more reflective of the people who live here? And one of we came up with 6 criteria, only 4 of which I can recall, but One of them was, the diversity of the population, the fullness of the population, which of course meant that there are women in Minnesota. And some of us felt that there should be more women reflected on the walls and in statutes and whatnot. Another thing is the issue of racial diversity, with the exception of depictions of Dakota during the Dakota War. There seemed to be very few, if any, images of Native Americans, of first Minnesotans shown on the walls. And so we wanted to, and of course, African Americans are not present for the most part. There is a likeness of Nellie, I can't remember her name, and I'm ashamed to say that, but she's part of the monument statuary in the front of the Capitol. But with the exception of her, there's no reflection at all of other peoples of color. And it was odd because we're sitting in the conference room at this time in the Capitol, just off the hallway that I imagined Nellie Francis actually walking, because as we will get back to later on, she was the principal lobbyist for the passage of the anti-lynching bill. And she walked those halls to persuade legislators to vote in favor of it. That in itself is an incredible story, and we'll get back to it later. But the long and the short of it was that the historians and the archivists who were part of the committee that I was on knew nothing of Nellie Francis, that she was a non-entity for all intents and purposes. And, that was a reason for me to want to do something about that, to bring her story to light. I didn't know as much as I would come to know, and that's kind of inevitable when you write a book. You don't know what you come to learn. But I found that her life was far more complex and full, much fuller than anything I could have imagined. And her life really kind of drew me into a side of the world and experience, a human experience that was beyond my reach, initially. For that reason, I was always kind of unnerved by or intimidated by the challenge of trying to do justice to her life. I was constantly talking with my wife and saying, do I have this right? Am I wrong? What are my assumptions here? And so she played every bit as much of a key role in helping me to write this thing as no one else played as much of a role in this. In any event, Nellie Francis is the topic for today. Her life was very complex. And we're only going to focus on one key aspect of it, that part that's most relevant to the fact that we are on the cusp of heading into Women's History Month, leaving African American Black History Month. She was an African American who didn't look like an African American, and so as a result, she was a person who kind of lived between two different worlds, which was both an asset and a liability for her. And we'll explore some of those things later on. But I think it was a source of real power for her. And it may have been a key reason for why she could take the lead of trying to create a bridge between Black women and white women in particular. So we'll look at that, and I'm hoping to not be so long-winded that we won't have time for questions and for discussion, observation. This is a picture of Nellie. This is a graduation picture, actually. She was the second African-American child to graduate from Central High School. Her sister was the first. Nellie was a star from the beginning. She was very attractive, as you can tell, but you can also tell that she was a person who did not easily fit into a particular category. And I think for that reason, people were drawn to her because of their sense of curiosity, trying to figure out, well, who is she? Is she Black or is she white? Both of her parents were African American, but they weren't sure how to pigeonhole her, and as a result, they had to wait for her to define herself, and they were always surprised when she clearly identified as being an African American. So many people were thinking, well, as non-African as she looked, she would prefer to be a person who was white, or certainly someone who was not African American, because of the stigma that was associated with that. But she really surprised people by, as a child, embracing her African descent, her African roots. And you got to ask yourself, from where does that come? Well, we'll come back to that in a couple minutes. The key thing with this picture is that it showed her in the wake of a speech that she gave. Her high school teacher, English teacher, encouraged her to participate in a competition, speech competition, where she could write on anything that she wanted. And she did enter the competition and did very well. People were sitting on the edges of their seats and were amazed at her articulation, her dramatic presence on stage, but also the audacity to talk about this particular topic at this time in St. Paul history. Bear in mind the fact that the vast majority of the people living in St. Paul at the time were white, but not just white, but immigrants. And this was a volatile time in American history, where immigrants oftentimes saw Blacks as a threat, and at least had received approval, support in victimizing Blacks by viewing themselves as competitors against Blacks. So there was a hostility that existed between the immigrant community, many immigrants, not all, many immigrant groups, and the African American. You add to that the fact that St. Paul was a working class town, and you have this class tension between working class white people and Black people that was always really intense. You add to that the fact that this was a Democratic town, which was not the Democratic Party of today, but a much more conservative party that tended to enable or abet the stuff that was going on in the South, the white supremacist activities of the South. So for all intents and purposes, there were a lot of people in St. Paul who were skeptical at best of Black people. And here was this young Black girl on stage, and she was a person who kind of confused or complicated their passions enough for them to at least pay attention to her. This is what she said. And I'm saying this in part. I'm only going to read a section of the speech. May the people of this country, North and South, East and West, early awake to the sense of their duty and thoroughly realize that the race problem must be settled right. And only then, I'm talking about a young girl, 17-year-old, talking to an audience predominantly white who had never had contact with Black people and probably didn't like them. She's uttering these words to this audience. And only then will the early rays of the morning sun kiss the fair land of the happy, peace-loving, you got to love the articulation here, the poetry, peace-loving, justice-doing people, and then can all the people, Black and white, American and foreign-born, she's including everyone, right, shout from one grand shout that shall sound and resound from pole to pole and from sunrise to sunset. This is the land of the free. Wow. Now, this speech was covered by all of the press in St. Paul, the Republican press, the Democratic press, the working class press, the progressive press, the Irish press, the French-speaking press. They all of which are each press represented different attitudes about race and took various positions on the political spectrum, but they all unanimously, after hearing this speech, sang her praises. According to the Appeal, which is the Black newspaper of St. Paul, her speech carried the House by storm. It was stunning. Over 2,000 people were in the audience. There were no Black people in the audience, and yet they all were moved by what Nellie said. So you got to ask the question, oh, I forgot to make one very important point. The person who won the competition, because she did not win it, was a white boy who wrote a piece entitled "Don't Be a Frog." Nellie's speech was entitled "The Race Problem." So you can see kind of the difference of emphasis, social consciousness in these two pieces. He would get a full scholarship to Harvard. She would eventually get a job as a stenographer. But the thing is that when she had a choice to do something else, she chose to go back into her community, to stay with her community. Now, the question I like to always ask myself is, where does this kid get that kind of gravitas, that sense of purpose, that sense of power? And of course, it comes from her parents. And of course, it comes from, she said things that Black leaders in St. Paul were inhibited in saying. The Black civil rights leaders, the men of the Black community, basically said nothing about the racial tensions in St. Paul, for the most part. They would complain about racism in other parts of the nation. They would talk about discriminatory laws that were on the books in places like Tennessee and Texas. But when it came down to discrimination in St. Paul, and it was widespread, they said very, very, very little. So here Nellie, 17 years old, a girl, is saying something that even the men of the community were disinclined to want to utter. Where does she get this gravitas? Well, it comes from her church. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham wrote Righteous Discontent, and in that book, I think she puts her finger exactly on the kind of community that a girl like Nellie grew up in. Normally, when we think about Black churches, we think about a patriarchy where the men are the bosses for the most part. The minister is the head of the community, and that women's jobs are principally to provide teas and cookies for functions. But what Higginbotham points out is that the church not only provided room for women's activities and women's participation and uplift, but it encouraged it. It actually encouraged it, not just by the older women in the community, but by the church. The male church leaders made room for that. Case in point, as Nellie is growing up, she gets more involved in suffrage, and this will be one of the key themes that will be a part of her life, as we will see. She's creating plays, and she's directing these plays as a young woman. And she's directing men to take different roles in the drama that she's drafting, that she's written, and they're following her lead on this. So there's a lot of support for her to explore these things, and for the women in the church to explore these ideas. Higginbotham writes, church women contested racist ideology and institutions through demands of anti-lynching legislation and an end to segregation laws. You can see that the foundation for Nellie's thinking is founded in the kinds of things that Higginbotham, a Harvard law professor, or Harvard history professor, is writing about. She doesn't know about Pilgrim, but she's writing. It's as if she is writing about Pilgrim Baptist Church. She goes on to say Black women expressed their discontent with both racial and gender discrimination and demanded equal rights for Blacks and women, advocating voting rights or equal employment and educational opportunities. The or is supposed to be and. Black women even drew upon the Bible, which is typically viewed as exclusively male-dominated structure, but they found stories in the Bible that would advance their agenda in dealing with anti-racism and anti-misogyny. Not anti-misogyny, but with anti-white women's equality. Black women even drew upon the Bible, the most respected source within their community, to fight for women's rights in the church. and in society in general. Now, you know, that to me was pretty astounding to see the role that the Black church played, at least the church experience that Nellie played. And I could see why she and her parents made sure to rear her in that kind of atmosphere, believing that she had a gift to, as a matter of fact, the newspaper referred to her as possessing the host within her, which is, you know, an indication of her role as a leader in the community. Higginbotham basically captures that notion in a way that I think I certainly missed at first. Now, it's important to bear in mind that all of this is occurring. I just want to remind or reiterate that Black St. Paul necessarily lived within an enclosed society, because St. Paul in general was not a safe place to go. At any given time, something bad could happen to you, simply because you were the wrong color, the wrong gender, in the wrong place. And we see two examples of that just 4 years later, after her graduation, within walking distance, really, of where this presentation occurred, where her presentation occurred. Henry Brown, a Black man, in April of 1895 is nearly lynched in the shadow of the state capitol. And just a couple months later, in June 2nd, 1895, the same year, Houston Osborne, another Black man, is nearly lynched on the corner of Lexington and Iglehart in St. Paul. Now, they weren't lynched, they weren't killed, but the rope did go around their neck. And but for the intervention of women, in one, as in the case of Osborne, or the police arriving in time, as was the case with Brown, you would have two murders committed in St. Paul because of the people who were identified, the two men being Black and in the wrong place at the wrong time. That's the St. Paul that Nellie is growing up in. That's the reality that Nellie is talking about, and that's the Nellie that's the St. Paul that Nellie is speaking out against. Now, this is an important picture, I think, because this occurs in 1902. And it's really the first example of her handiwork as a leader. Some of you may be, and I apologize for the resolution of this. This comes in the newspaper picture, but I don't know if you can see my cursor. I'm kind of zooming around. It's not a fly. Right here is Booker Washington. Over here is T. Thomas Fortune, Dean of Black journalism. Standing next to him is W.E.B. Du Bois. Down here is Ida Wells. I mean, what I'm portraying here, what I'm pointing out here, are the biggest names in the civil rights community, Black civil rights community in the nation at that time. They wanted to have a conference to discuss the agenda for civil rights for the 20th century. And they looked around the country and saw racism and discrimination and violence everywhere. It is in Minnesota where they found a place, or decided was a place that would be safe and would be receptive to their agenda, to this kind of discussion. And so they set the meeting in St. Paul. And one of the people who organized the meeting, in terms of finding accommodations for delegates to stay in, food, speakers, lining up speakers, was a young woman by the name of Nellie Francis, who unfortunately we don't see. Her likeness has been cropped off, which is, I think, an indication of how, despite her star qualities, she was a person who seemed to be willing to share the spotlight with other people. She did not seem to want to hog the limelight. So this is a conference that was held there. What's notable about this, other than the personalities present, if you look along the sides, you know, the fascia of the building itself, you'll see brick and stone. They're on the front steps. That is the front step. Those are the front steps of the state capitol. It'll be the last year that the Capitol will be used for legislative purposes. It will be replaced by the one that we know and love that presently stands in St. Paul, started in 1903. 1902 was the last year in which this will be held. The state legislature gave or handed over a chamber for these delegates to meet. Again, underscoring the racial tension in America. It was said, historians have said that we went through a period during this time where once a week, somewhere in America, a Black man was lynched. That was just how commonplace it was. Racism was everywhere. Racial violence was an ever-present problem. And yet they're meeting here in St. Paul, which tells you something about the reputation that St. Paul in Minnesota has as a liberal town. This is the notion of liberal exceptionalism and whatnot. But we still have the situation of the Black men who were nearly lynched. And so anyway, we'll move on. Three years later, the first chapter of the Federation of Colored Women's Clubs meets in St. Paul. And this is on the steps of Pilgrim Baptist Church, which you can tell just from this image is fairly impressive. These are women who gathered primarily in St. Paul and in Minneapolis, but from other parts of the what we now call the metro region, and some from Duluth. They came to discuss the various activities that were kind of ignored by other civil rights groups that were male dominated. Even the Niagara movement, which will begin this year, did not include women. This is a precursor to the NAACP, started by W.B. Du Bois. But that organization would not have any women participate because the men who were scheduled to come would not want to share, or did not want to share the spotlight with women. That would change a year later. The women's club movement was supposed to be a place where people could talk about the status and the security and the quality of life for women and families. Create and to begin to talk about the world as they see it in their own terms. Now, not all women's clubs that were a part of the Federation not all of them dealt with social justice type issues. They were whist clubs, they were various knitting clubs and things of that nature, and that tended oftentimes to be the extent of their participation. But they came together nonetheless to see each other under a common banner, and that in itself was a form of finding empowerment. Nellie was not a part of this group. Her sister participated in this, but it was an organization that had potential. It wasn't really until, I'm sorry, I kind of skipped ahead. So it would be an organization that was formed, but Nellie did not get involved with it for another couple years. The church becomes, as we said before, a key thing. The church, in order for it to become a factor in society, in order for it to be meaningful to the parishioners, to the Black parishioners, and in northern cities like St. Paul, a presence for white politicians to at least consider, even though they may be skeptical of Black people as equals, they still saw, at least among the men, votes. And so the church becomes a place where votes were necessary, which makes the church itself an important institution and allowed for Blacks to have some segue, some access to policymakers. How does the church begin to acquire more status in that world? They do it by having more people join. And how do they get more people to join? In this particular context, it was the music. I took a departure here where I think many of you, and I would have thought was, heading in a different direction. Music was key. It's the thing that draws. And when you start to think about Black churches, you think about the quality of singing and the choirs and how important that is. A church that doesn't have a good musical program, that doesn't have good musicians, and doesn't have a good choir, is a church that's really not going to succeed in terms of making a place for itself in the Black community itself. When Blacks are coming to town, they're either looking for a home or they're looking for a place to go on Sunday. They're asking about the music that's available. What's at the heart of a good musical presentation? It's not just the choir, and the choir certainly is that, but it's an organ. You've got to have a good organ. A church that has a poor organ is a church that's not going to be able to attract the musicians that you need in order to perform. And Pilgrim had a very bad organ. They needed to get it replaced. And as you would imagine, organs cost money, and more money than the parishioners themselves were able to raise. And after a couple of years of trying to raise money for this organ, they finally went to this young woman, Nellie Francis, to kind of lead the campaign. And this is what she does. She goes to New York City. This is in 1909. She goes to New York City, and she walks along Riverside Drive and goes up to a mansion and knocks on the door and asks to speak to this guy with white hair and a beard, very kind of elegant looking man. That's Andrew Carnegie, the wealthiest man in America at the time. And she asks him, you can imagine the audacity here, that can only come from grace and status and confidence. She's in her early 20s. She asked this guy for the dough. Come up with some money. We want to build this church. And he says yes. And he gives her the money that she needs in order to take back to the church so they could come up with a new organ. When she leaves his house with the good news, she contacts the man in the top left corner. That's William Francis. That's her husband. He's an attorney. And he says, before you come home, I want you to go to Washington, D.C. I need you to do something down there. So instead of returning to St. Paul immediately, she goes to Washington, D.C. and is met at the train station by this guy. That's Amos Clapp. He's the United States Senator for Minnesota. Now, Amos Clapp went to law school with Billy Francis. That's her husband. They were law school buddies. And he was one of the founders of what would become William Mitchell Law School. But he takes Nellie and escorts her to the White House, where she will meet this guy. That's President William Howard Taft. And she will meet two other presidents throughout her lifetime. And she impresses them all. Afterwards, Clapp escorts her to the U.S. Capitol, where she's able to sit in the gallery, a very exclusive place, where she could observe the operations of Congress, something that few African Americans had a chance to see. So you can see that the word went out already that this was a special person. When she returned to St. Paul, she returned as a celebrity, because all of her trips were documented in the appeal. The Black community in St. Paul knew what she was doing. The Black people in Minneapolis knew what she was doing. And of course, knowing that one of their own was being respected and feted by the most powerful white men in America gave her immediate cachet. This was a token of appreciation from the Black community. It was of us. And this tended to be something that I think, was like a trophy of appreciation. But the key thing is this last phrase: she was anointed, the community's grande dame. So she came back a star. She was already elevated to high status. 1912, some years later, just about 3 years later, she decides to get involved with the Minnesota Federation of Colored Women's Clubs, the organization that she had not participated with, because she could see the potential of that organization. You walk down the street of St. Paul and you see tenements, you see poverty, you see kids out of school, you see men out of work, you see alcoholism running rampant, and that the clubs, the federation itself was not really addressing those issues. She felt that this organization could do that. And she became president. And within the same year of becoming president, she became an officer of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. So her career is skyrocketing, immediately skyrocketing. It's as if the world had discovered the star. High praise from the Black press, 1912. Her election closed in a blaze of glory. The Minneapolis newspaper says it was a pleasure to her to know that she was elected without opposition. Now, you think about that for a second. She ran without opposition. It is easy to conclude that everybody loved her. But we're talking about human nature. And if we think about it, we probably would not be surprised at what Juno Frankie Say Pierce observed. That there's going to be envy. The seeds of envy were being planted. And indeed, that's what she says. The seeds of envy were planted by our own. She's talking about other Black women who had been a part of the movement for, a much longer period, basically was forced to take the side table to this person who came out of nowhere, this young person who came out of nowhere. They even, in some instances, some of the critics who kept it quiet referred to her as a porcelain doll. That's meant to be a put down. In any event, Nellie Juno Frankie Say Pierce, very amazing name, was Nellie's aunt. She was Nellie's mother's sister. And she was a leader of the Tennessee suffrage campaign in Nashville. Nellie's family comes from Nashville. We'll talk about that later on. But Juno had this wisdom to share. She would be an advisor. I talked about where does Nellie get this sense of clarity, the sense of purpose, this identity, and strategy acumen? Well, she's surrounded by very, very, very smart people. And Juno was one of them. Juno understood the challenges of mounting an interracial, and I should say intraracial campaign. She understood the challenges that existed there. So Nellie was faced with an uphill struggle to bridge parallel worlds. Blacks and whites lived in parallel worlds. Getting Black women to trust white women was going to be a challenge. Getting white women to validate the basis of Black skepticism toward them was going to be a challenge. Learning that racism, trying to remind women that that racism still hurts, no matter how benign, no matter how unintended it was, that still hurts. Getting Black women to trust Nellie's leadership. If Nellie wants to try to bridge these parallel worlds, can we trust Nellie's judgment here? After all, she comes from privilege. And in a time where light skin is basically an indication of privilege, a lot of Black women were skeptical of the privilege that she held. Does she feel better than us? So that's one reason why some of them did not trust her leadership. Getting white allies to understand, even after ratification, that race would still matter. There was this kind of hopeful view that if we get suffrage passed, and all of a sudden all the problems in the world, certainly all the problems confronting all women, will be solved just by having the right to vote. But that wasn't possible. And she was trying to make everyone understand that the struggle would continue, even though we had the ballot. You add to that the fact that racial politics was very deeply situated within various corners of the suffrage movement. Indeed, the movement reflected the nation's racial attitudes. This cartoon kind of reflects that, and the sign that, a woman is that's at the top of the caption says, "Just like the men, women could be just as racist as their husbands." And then you have the Southern strategy, where Carrie Chapman Catt, who was president of the national movement, basically endorsed the notion of being able and willing to betray their Black allies and to advance the movement. In other words, there were a lot of Southern politicians who understood that if women in general got the right to vote, and in sections like in the South, where a lot of the women who would get the right to vote were also Black, then it would tip the balance of power against the Southern Bourbon class. And so it was to the advantage of maintaining power in the hands of the white leadership to either separate the women groups or to persuade white women to walk away from Black women, to forget about them. This was a strategy from the national office. At the same time, 1915. Now, I want you to consider all of this in the context. This scene is a challenge that Nellie faced in trying to persuade the Black woman to trust the white ally, the white woman, and that it was very difficult because Black women are dealing with rejection from white women, and that Black women are looking at Nellie and saying, why should we trust them? They don't trust us. Why should we embrace them? They don't embrace us. In 1915, Birth of a Nation comes to Minneapolis, comes to Minnesota, actually, because it appears in various communities throughout the state, and of course in Minneapolis and in St. Paul. The mayor of the city of Minneapolis, Mayor Nye, N-Y-E, doesn't like the film at all, and for the right reasons, but he's also a politician, which means he's not going to close the movie down, which he had the authority to do according to city ordinance. Rather than upsetting what was considered, which was obvious, a very large support base for Birth of a Nation, he decides to select a panel, to impanel a group of Minneapolis citizens, all of whom are white, all of whom are male, to give him advice as to whether this movie should be allowed to continue to be shown. One of the people who was a part of that committee was a man by the name of Dr. F.E. Spalding, superintendent of Minneapolis schools. And in October 1915, he says, in part, "Its wonderful educational value cannot be overestimated. It should be seen by all." So he's a fan of this film. These are some of the promotional images from for educational entertainment. The image on the right is a depiction, or is a picture, a still from the film itself. The man who is meant to look like a Black man is actually a white guy in blackface. He's representing the character Gus, who is accused of attacking a white woman, and the Klan is about to lynch him in this picture. And when they do, when the Klan captures him and lynches him, the audience, it is reported, cheered. This is Minneapolis, Schubert Theater. And then in the accompanying picture, now there's colorized, of course, but the image it depicts John Wilkes Booth after he's assassinated President Lincoln. And this was considered yet another image that appealed to Klansmen. And it too created cheers from the audience. I mean, this is Minneapolis. Minnesota was the first state in the Union to send regulars, to send volunteers into the Union Army when President Lincoln called for volunteers. This was after Fort Sumter had been fired upon. But several decades later, now he's considered the villain by a certain, think about January 6th. It seems like this is an example of history sort of repeating itself, where those who would carry the flag of the Confederacy and would denigrate, are basically the more patriotic of those who would defend those images. But it's not just the walking, the guy on the street who is embracing the Klan, but there are friends of Black people who were embracing this film, Birth of a Nation. Nellie has to respond to this leaflet where during Suffrage Week in Albert Lee, the organizers use free tickets to Birth of a Nation as a means of creating interest in joining the suffrage movement. Harken back to that image of the white woman rejecting the Black woman, the African-American woman who's listening to Nellie say, look, we got to join with white women in order to get suffrage passed, are responding with considerable skepticism that this doesn't make sense, Nellie. Why are you making a point? They don't want to work with us. This image also illustrates how we're kind of looking at this as a benign marketing device, which is to say that we're not sympathetic, we're not sensitive to the passions or the history. We're not sympathetic or responsive to the fears and the experience of African Americans in this country. And so the question is, how can we trust, a community that just doesn't get it? This was a section of the country that supported the Civil War. They didn't like going to Civil War, but they felt the need to keep the Union together. And they also passed the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments that made African-American men equal to white men. And yet now, here in the same state, we have these images being celebrated. Now, Nellie is dealing with that backlash, with the criticism of her Black sisters as to the futility of trying to unite with white sisters in advancing the suffrage movement. This article appears in the paper that gets her attention. This is, again, the same year the Birth of a Nation comes out. Now, I'm not going to ask you to read it. It's the resolution, once again, isn't great, but it's about the long and the short of it is that it's about what the Detroit Women's Club does at this particular time. This is an organization that had decided to break from the policies of the National Federation of Women's Club. That's the white organization, by accepting membership of a Black women's club in Detroit. They were going to break the precedent by allowing Black women to join this all-white organization. This is the Detroit Federation. And the National Federation, I'm sorry if I'm losing you, if I might lose some of you. The Detroit Federation basically is attacked by the National Federation of white organizations. If you continue to allow Black women in the group, we will disinherit you. We will remove your charter. We will kick you out of the Federation. So you have the white federal organization against the city organization, willing to punish them for letting Black women in their group. Now, Nellie wants to have the colored women's clubs play a role in this to support the white women in Detroit. And she attempts to organize a movement from within the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. Mrs. Booker T. Washington is president and a mentor of Nellie Francis at the time. So Nellie's expecting the president to back her in this. But that doesn't happen. the Black Federation turns against Nellie. And they do that for this reason. If you look at the bottom of the slide, you see that the person, and Nellie signs this petition that appears in the press. She signs it, Chairman, Press Company, National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, St. Paul. What she did here was breach protocol, because what she did, she signed in the name of the association as a national leader without the approval of the national organization for this move. And so she had gotten ahead of the organization. And what that does is open her up to attack from those who are envious of her. Remember some time ago we talked about with Juno saying, you know, look, there's envy, the seeds have been planted within our own community. They're now beginning to, it's been watered, and the envy has sprouted through the surface. There was a reason now for people to go after Nellie. You know, there was a reason for people to feel, yes, indeed, she feels better than the rest of us. And for that reason, we're going to oust her from the organization. And she is, in fact, ousted. Nellie's friend, Mrs. Booker Washington, her name was Maggie, was upset with how she was treated, but did not have the political influence to change the course of what was about to happen. And so Francis is ousted from the organization. She's ousted from position, from that office, and she's ousted from the organization. Just months afterwards, February 2nd, 1917, you see another example of how white businessmen saw the Klan as a wonderful marketing device. An estimated 500 Klansmen drove brand new cars furnished by Minneapolis auto dealers through Minneapolis and St. Paul to promote sales. Now, there's nothing in that demonstration illustrating, you know, the intent to be malicious to African Americans. But you can imagine a Black person who's standing on the corner of a certain age, who may have experienced Reconstruction, certainly experienced racial violence at the end of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century, is going to have a different attitude from the number of whites who saw this and were drawn to it out of curiosity and, you know, perhaps a perverse sense of attraction. Weeks later, America enters World War I to keep the world safe for democracy. Later that year, just months later, actually, once we're into war, the race riots of East St. Louis occur. And you can see over here in the headlines, 100 Negroes are shot, burned, clubbed to death in East St. Louis race riot. And the left image is a cartoon that appears. And it's an interesting choice of Black people, of a person representing the Black community, of the Black race. It's not a Black male in the patriarchal society. It's not a Black male, but it's a Black woman protecting children. And the caption, which unfortunately is not here, basically is beseeching Woodrow Wilson, President Wilson, you know, yes, we're going to fight a war to you know, protect a democracy, but how about fighting a war to protect all of your citizens? That's the caption in effect down the bottom. But it also underscores and illustrates, once again, why Black people are, especially many of those who are skeptical of the direction that Nellie wants to go, why they are skeptical that white people are prepared and willing and interested in joining forces with Black people. Now, this person, I think, is, well, she's a star too, Clara Ewing. And you no doubt are familiar with her. She was president of the Minnesota Women's Suffrage Association. and would later become the first president of the League of Women Voters. This was after the ratification was made of the 19th Amendment. She would become a friend and mentor to Nellie Francis, who Euland referred to as a spirit of a flame. The thing about this is that she was a brilliant tactician and strategist. She was a product of her time. She had, a sense of privilege kind of clouding her view of people, but she also could see talent, and she also understood how to wage a campaign better than any other person I could see. And she saw in Nellie skills that could be used as a partner in this effort to persuade legislators to. She knew how to write, she knew how to speak, and she understood how to reach across different lines. So Clara saw in Nellie a person who could be helpful in the campaign. And what this did, now remember, Nellie had been out in the wilderness for all intents and purposes after she was ousted from the colored organization. She had no one, basically, and she went into what I think was perhaps a period of depression, and I guess you can imagine why she would, in fact, be depressed. But she just kind of went away. She just disappeared and went out to the cabin and just stayed there, didn't interact with anybody or anything. But in meeting with Clara Euland, she began to find, a person who believed in her, a person who could see, who could show her, look, this is the next stage of your development, in effect. And so she becomes reborn, in effect. Nellie writes an op-ed piece that appears on the front page of the St. Paul Pioneer Press and in the Appeal. That's to show that she's writing to both white and Black people. And the title, is her call for a broad united stand. And this is just an excerpt from this speech, or from that article. This broad united stand of the suffrage body for the principles of democracy, which must include Black women as well as white, will win for the cause of suffrage many sympathizers who would otherwise have been indifferent to its success. Now, that's an interesting phrase right there. She's writing to many sympathizers who would otherwise have been indifferent to its success. She's talking about Black women who agree that suffrage is important and philosophically, or at least, theoretically understand that by virtue of being a distinct minority, in order to get any agenda moving forward that could advance the race, you've got to have alliances. But there just been too many moments in recent past where we have reason to question whether that change of attitude could occur. And for that reason, we're not all that excited about supporting this movement. Nellie is saying we've got to support the movement. It's important that we appear in the movement, because that gives us a sense of ownership of the movement. But still, there's reason to be reluctant to trust. Nationwide, we're entering into a period called the Red Summer, infamous period called the Red Summer, 1919. Racist savagery is normalized. White on Black riots in 36 cities occur. In Arkansas, within one evening, an estimated 240 Blacks and 5 whites were killed, a period when Black lives mattered even less. Yet, that same year, Red Summer ended generally around September or late August of 1919. And September 9th, 1919, the suffrage amendment was ratified in Minnesota. Leaders in the suffrage fight, and legislators exchanged congratulations, according to the front page of the Minneapolis Tribune. But this is the key point here. Black women remain cautious. And they're cautious for this reason. would more Blacks die as a result of the expansion of Black suffrage? Would we be abandoned by white friends again? Now, what they're talking about in that first statement is that white supremacy had already been rekindled in the wake of Appomattox, in the wake of the Civil War. But when the 15th Amendment is enacted, is ratified, and it becomes law, then white supremacy really ignites and spreads rapidly throughout the South. And it occurs on the watch of the Republican Party, the Friends of African Americans. So it seems as if the Friends have abandoned Blacks because they're not doing enough to deal with the racism and the violence that's going on throughout the South. And so a lot of Black people are wondering, are we going to go through the same thing? With this ratification, even though a handful of voters are from Minnesota and are African American, the principle of enfranchising Black women is a reason for us to anticipate or fear violence will occur. Months later, this occurs. I should have warned you, I'm sorry. This is the lynching of 3 Black men in Duluth. And it isn't, this thing does not occur because of the passage of the amendment, the ratification of the amendment, but for African Americans who have a long history with violence in the hands of white mobs. It's hard to separate the events leading up to the lynchings in Duluth with suffrage in light of the experience that they had in the 1870s and at the end of the 19th century. The thing about it as well is that I'm going to show this image one more time, okay? Because I think it's kind of important. And I apologize because it is disturbing. The author of the book, Lynching of Duluth, originally had that picture on the front cover. Very disturbing picture. The author of that book also had a copy of the book on the coffee table of his father. Michael Fido was the author. He's from Duluth. He had it sitting on the coffee table that belonged to his father. His father had a friend come over to visit and noticed the book. The cover is eye-catching and was shocked at what she saw. Because, yes, the 2 Black men are hanging there in full view, and there's a dead body on the ground in front of them. But what shocked her even more was the fact that she recognized her father as one of the members of the mob, smiling into the camera. She knew nothing about that whatsoever. And so this is the other side of the tensions, the bridge, the gap between Blacks and whites during this time. Bad things happen, and white people were able successfully to forget about it, to ignore it, to move on, and to even criticize Blacks for constantly reminding whites of the sins of the past. And with this was another reason for why it was difficult to bridge that parallel world. We think you're being overly sensitive. We think that the images of Birth of a Nation is, you're taking it much too seriously. This is 1916, then 1920. We have an image that could have been taken from Birth of a Nation. Well, the first election that included women's vote occurred in 1920. And Nellie and her husband and others were very active in preparing women to vote, to register and to vote, African-American women to vote and to participate in that celebration of democracy. And once that was passed, once the election was passed, and all of the good guys got elected, Nellie then prepared another campaign later that year, she and her husband began to look at legislation dealing with anti-lynching. And they worked with the national branch of the NAACP. And then Nellie wrote the law and lobbied it through the legislature. Excuse me. And it passed in both houses. The newspaper gives her credit for that. She is responsible for its introduction. And the vote was quite amazing. House vote 81-1 in favor of passing the bill. And in the Senate, it was 41-0. So again, jump back to what I said earlier on. I'm sitting in this conference room looking at the art to be placed on the Capitol walls, thinking about Nellie walking down that same hallway, at the beginning of the century. And this is what she was doing, getting this bill passed. There's going to be a celebration commemorating the passage of this bill. And it is going to occur in St. Paul, but it's meant to be a statewide celebration. After all, St. Paul is the capital of the state. No one from Duluth, where the lynchings occurred, comes to celebrate. No one from Minneapolis comes to celebrate. And so as a result, this becomes a St. Paul affair. You could see how deeply the envy and resentment against Nellie had gone, despite the work that she had done. And in fact, Reverend Charles Miller comments on that. Unlike many others of the race with equal advantage who had dodged behind pillars and posts to get away from the race, you had brought the race up with you. People were saying that she's in it for herself. And he's saying they were wrong. He goes on to say, so mind not what others say or think in those matters concerning you and the race. Live so as to make the most of life God had given you, and let the tongues wag as they may. It is a sad mistake to say there are only 7 deadly sins. There are 8, and ingratitude is the first. Now, at no time in this career does Nellie talk about the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that come at her. At no time does she defend herself against the quiet attacks of her those who were envious of her. At no time does she do that. But at the same presentation, she does make this statement. We must have the courage to enlist the cooperation of those who would sponsor our cause and be of service. Let us present a united front. So she's never backed away from the call to unite, to be united with all and everyone who wanted to be a part of her. She starts a suffrage club called Everywoman Suffrage Club, not limited to African Americans, but to anybody who wants to join up. This will also be her last public speech, last public presentation. And she's also kind of, turned off by politics at this particular point. She and her husband leave the Dale Selby neighborhood, which is where the concentration of African Americans existed in St. Paul. And they moved to a house that's in a white neighborhood over by McAllister, actually, Cretan McAllister, in that general vicinity. But it's a white neighborhood. And they have, when they hear that a Black family is about to move in, signs go up all over. Colored persons not welcome in the district. This is 1924. When word got out, the Francis's decades of public service, leadership, Republican politics, and middle-class respectability counted for nothing. This is a quote from Paul Nelson, a lawyer and a lawyer and historian, in his article, William T. Francis, that appears in Ramsey County History magazine. He basically said, look, despite all that they've done, they are abandoned in effect. This is the kind of thing that a lot of Black women anticipated. And so in a sense, what they said has come true. We're also entering to a period where discrimination against housing is spreading throughout Minneapolis and St. Paul. And perhaps you're familiar with the work of Kirsten Delegard, where she's having citizens of Minneapolis look at their deeds and to see whether there are restrictive covenants that prohibit white owners from selling their homes to Black people. That's spreading throughout the cities of both St. Paul, Minneapolis, and yet not only are they dealing with discrimination, but they're also dealing with the Klan, who's meeting and marching out in front and marring the house and burning crosses and whatnot. They also, I might add, got permission from the city to hold these demonstrations. So that says something very interesting. 1924, and I'm almost done. So 1924, they moved to Liberia. Billy receives a presidential appointment to serve as consul to Liberia. 3 years later, he died of yellow fever. Nellie brings the body back, but in order to, she's not able to afford transporting his body to Nashville, where she has now relocated. And so she has to lobby Congress to receive an enactment that would allow her to be able to move his body, a federal official, to his place of burial in Nashville. She lived for 40 years in Nashville without much association with St. Paul. That in itself was kind of stunning, the issue with Congress, but she moved to Nashville, lived there for 40 years, didn't say anything for the most part. Most people didn't even know her connection to St. Paul, and would die on December 13th, 1969 at the age of 95. She worked up until the time she died. Worked at the Tennessee State University. This is her final resting place. This is in the same cemetery that her father founded in Nashville. But I like this picture. It's inspiring to me. Though deaf and blind, she saw the torch that she lit pass on. Diane Nash, Nashville, Tennessee, during the sit-ins movements, with the beginning of the modern civil rights. She was a part of that. And Diane, there's so many similarities between Diane Nash, who's up front, and Nellie Francis. So with that, I'm done. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Willingreen. I invite people to unmute and ask questions.
I have a question.
Sure.
Thank you for the presentation. Really interesting. I was wondering about how restrictive the state laws were in Minnesota around the time of women's suffrage, for Black and brown women, women of color, because I know some states use state laws to, intimidate or keep people of color from voting. Mm-hmm. Was Minnesota one of those, or how'd they address it?
No, that's an important question, because what it does is highlight the fact that Minnesota did not have, after 1919, when the state ratified, in 1920 when it was nationally ratified, there were no discriminatory laws per se in Minnesota. But that's the other side of that same point, is that discrimination continued almost without any kind of challenge. And this is the thing that makes the Minnesota experience so curious, that even though the numbers of legislators who supported removing that bar against women, and the laws that protected public accommodations for African Americans, it was amended twice. Despite those laws that banned discrimination continued. And it continued without any kind of challenge, either in the court system. Policymakers who had supported these laws did nothing to put teeth in these laws. So you have the kind of parallel reality of what was real and what was Memorex in effect.
Yeah, so it was like, hey, don't discriminate, but we're not going to enforce that in any way.
That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And you know, and the way that the teeth were removed from the law was that it made discrimination affordable to the discriminator. That is to say that it would, you know, these cases would go to trial, and a jury would be selected, and oftentimes a jury found in favor of, let's say, for example, a Black couple that wanted to go to a restaurant, or Black women who wanted to go to a theater. The jury would hold in their favor, but would find the person who was in charge of discrimination, who owned the facility, a minimal sum, so that it didn't really create a problem for the person. It didn't discourage further discrimination. That was the Minnesota way of dealing with race relations and gender relations.
Thank you. It sounds familiar to
Yeah.
today. I mean, live and let live Minnesota policies.
Well, as far as race was concerned, and you're talking about Black women or women of Native American women or women of any color, white women were able to go to the theater, but Black women were relegated to what was called the nigger corner, namely the balcony. And the white women did not stand up in behalf of the Black women. This is another aspect of what Juno learned in Nashville. Even though she was an African American and participated in the suffrage movement, she knew that racism would continue, and not just from the white guys, but from, you know, their wives and their sisters and their mothers, that racism would continue. And that when discrimination was done against Black women, their white allies would not stand by them. So it's the kind of thing that we hear time and time again about, you know, from the Black women in Minnesota. Bear in mind the fact that a large number of African American women were of an age that, you know, of people who lived through Reconstruction, were on the watch of the Republican Party, of the party of Lincoln, as I call them. You know, white supremacy spread throughout the South and deepened in the North. You don't have lynchings to the same extent that you see in the South, but you see discrimination laws. You see, you know, restaurants and public accommodations being denied to African Americans in the North, and that's not addressed for all intents and purposes. As a matter of fact, the federal law that banned discrimination in 1875, with the Civil Rights Act of 1875, was later repealed by the United States Supreme Court in the civil rights cases, 1883. That basically said that that's unconstitutional, that banning discrimination was unconstitutional. So discriminating against people of color in particular was something that was hard baked or hot wired, or was very much a part of what was acceptable in the body and social politic of America. Thank you for the question.
Dr. Green, we had a question about Nellie and did she do any activism after she left St. Paul? And if so, what did that look like?
No, she didn't. I think she had paid her dues. She was tired. She did, before leaving St. Paul, she was active again in the church, but in terms of education and things of that nature, she was interested in education for kids. But when she moved to Nashville, she was active in the church and participated in schools and education for Black kids in particular. Of course, they were segregated from the white kids. But she did not get involved in politics afterwards. She was just kind of burned out. Incidentally, her grandmother, who would live until she was 117 years old, was active. in lobbying and participating in politics. And Juno, who was the younger sister of her mother, was also, as you could see, she was, a leader and represented African Americans in an otherwise white organization. Nellie came from that pedigree. These were women who were saying, okay, we know the challenges, and we know that some of the challenges are securing relationships with our white sisters. We know that challenge exists, and we know the challenges also in keeping our own sisters in line, keeping them inspired to do something that in their gut is unnerving, and that is trusting. They still participated in that role. You can see in Juno's comment to Nellie, the sense that, there's envy that's growing up within our own people, but you have to know that and proceed. You got to anticipate. And I think that's one reason why Nellie just didn't give voice to the pain that she felt from the reprisals that she received from her sisters who were supposed to have her back. I'm kind of going off. I'm not even sure that I addressed your question. I'm sorry, but.
It's interesting to hear about her grandmother being 117.
Yeah.
And she was in Nashville?
Nashville. But when Nellie was doing battle with the Sisters of the Minnesota chapter, her grandmother came up here and spoke. She came up here and spoke. She and Juno, they were taking care of their baby, in effect, and she went to churches and spoke in behalf of suffrage. She went to white churches as well as Black churches. She was amazing. I found one picture of her. She looked pretty intimidating. Now, my publisher found a much more benign looking picture of her. I tended to prefer the one that I found because you didn't want to mess with Nellie. Her name was Nellie as well. She was the daughter of an enslaved woman and the master. And she moved to Nashville. She grew up on a plantation just outside Nashville. But as soon as emancipation was established, she kind of went her own way. And I could go off on them. Books need to be written about them as well.
I was about to ask if you know of any materials about her grandmother, any books or anything.
I don't know of any books, but I did come across material about her. I write a little bit about. I'm not trying to market the book. You can get the book in the library or something, but I do write about her, and I do have citations that you can refer to. And there are. I don't know exactly where Eric, who lives down the road from where you are, Eric Anderson. I don't know where he found that image. But the image that I found was in the Tennessean newspaper. I think it was in the Banner or the Tennessean. And there is a profile of her. The article itself it's fairly lengthy for an individual person. It was her birthday that they wanted to commemorate. And if I can send you by way of, send it to Kelsey, a citation, you can kind of track it down if you have access to newspaper.com.
Send it over. I'm sure there's somebody that would love to see it. If not,
I will do that. I will do that.
The kind of two last questions I want to just kind of ask as we're thinking about the end of the day is, one, when did you first learn about Nellie? And then the second one is sort of a little bit of a book question. Yeah. You have a pile of books that these people should all be thinking about reading. What would you think would be the next one for them to consider after attending this out of your pile? Is it the new one coming out or something else?
Yeah, I've been working on, well, I've got one that's coming out this summer on the teacher strike, Minneapolis teacher strike, 1970. It's not just about the teacher strike, but it's kind of Minneapolis history. Most people don't know anything about Minneapolis history at this particular time, but it's the time not only of Mary Tyler Moore, which got started in 1970, but it's also the time where Minnesota and Minneapolis in particular saw all kinds of strikes occurring. And so that's one book that's coming out. I also have been working on a book called Uncertain Brethren, which is really the history of liberalism in Minnesota. It starts really at the beginning of the century and comes up. And I look at the birth of the Republican Party. So it sounds much drier than I hope it will turn out to be. But that's another thing that I've done. And I'm kind of nearing the end of a piece. It's a book called The Colored Attorney of Flower City. The trials, what is it? The life and trials of William Morris, an African-American attorney in Minneapolis, very successful. The opening scene has him going to his office, which was at the time at the top of the tallest building in the upper Midwest. And this is at night. He goes to the place and he goes up in the elevator to the top floor, and he kind of just absorbs and takes in the view from being that high up. And then he climbs over the railing and dives, commits suicide. And so, the obvious question is, why would he do that? That becomes really the genesis of the book. He was one of the authors of the anti-discrimination law, incidentally, in 1899. So, what was that all about? Why would he commit suicide after he seemed to achieve everything? So those are the three that I'm working on right now. So.
Well, the other question is, when did you first learn of Nellie? Have you always known, or did you find out about her at some stage, and what was the inspiration?
Well, I think about that. I'm not sure when I first learned about her, but I know I developed a crush on her, and that was something I had to negotiate with my wife. You don't have to worry about it, babe, she's gone. But she also came from Nashville. That's where she grew up. That's where she was born. And I lived in Nashville for a while. My dad was dean at Fisk University. So, I kind of lived in the neighborhood where she lived. But I think that it was really through word of mouth, learning about her as the author of the anti-lynching law, and that there was nothing written about her. And for good reason. You have the proverbial loose thread in your shirt or something, or blouse or jacket that you pull, and the next thing you know, something's weakening. Well, for me, it was the resolve to not deal with her, because there are so many questions about her that, brought me deeper into her. I thought the story was really one-dimensional, but it was always what I think every writer deals with, well, then what happened? Well, then what happened? That becomes the stimulus to delving even deeper into the life of the subject that you're working on. You don't know how this is going to end. You don't know how this works. And she was such a mystery, because she doesn't really write about herself that much. Other things are written about her, and she definitely appears in the press, but she doesn't really kind of divulge herself. And I'm wondering, well, why is she holding back? It was that kind of thing that drew me into it. So, knowing that she dealt with this lynching bill, but then seeing her as a vehicle through that time period, learning about the Black middle class. That's something I didn't even know was a topic worth looking at, but I could see it more clearly through her experience. Learning about, being a woman in the Black middle class, was that part of the reason why she didn't talk about herself, that kind of discretion that you embraced? What does it mean when she goes silent, and when her mother goes silent? Instead of wearing a party gown, she's wearing this funereal gown, just before she dies. The way that the medical profession treated women was another area that I hadn't anticipated. There's so many aspects of her life that I knew nothing about that kind of drew me in. So how it began with with something that was much more accessible to a historian and a male. But the more I got into her life, the more I was drawn into, I went in places I didn't expect to go. So I don't think that fully answers the question. Have me back in a couple months.
Yeah, that's what I just was thinking. Well, I've just enjoyed learning from you today, Doctor. And it's just been really a joy to hear all the things you know. And, I think more information gives us all more tools. And I think we're all going to dig a little deeper into the story you told us today, and appreciate the research that you have done so we can have this knowledge. And I look forward to digging some of your other books, because I know that just listening to some of the things I have already, there's so much more to learn from you, having to do with African Americans and fur trade, having to do with the importance of barbers, just the nuances, so many nuanced things that you have highlighted in other presentations and in the other books. So more reading for all of us. And yes, we'd love to talk about having you back again in the future, and maybe in person, being that I know that you love this neck of the woods.
Oh yeah. It's our second home.
Well, thank you everybody for coming, and thank you, Dr. Green. Please tell your wife thank you as well for her help.
I will indeed. And thank you all for showing up. I appreciate this. Thank you.
Yes, and we will be in touch soon.
Absolutely.
Take care, everybody. Have a great day.
Take care.